Welcome to Being Human with Steve Cuss. On Being Human, we bring to the surface the invisible dynamics that infect all of our relationships. And we're not just talking our relationships with other humans, other people. We're also paying attention to our relationship with ourself and how easily we are disconnected from self. And we also notice how these dynamics tend to infect our relationship with God. Not that God goes anywhere and God is disconnected, but we become disconnected from awareness of God. When you're in a reactive state, one of the first things to go away is awareness of God's presence. As Jacob confessed in Genesis 28, surely the Lord was in this place and I was not aware of it. And that's why no matter what you're doing, no matter the context by which you're watching or listening, we pause on the pod and we light a candle and we relax into God's presence. We remember the Lord. So I just light a candle today and remember that God is with us and that God holds us. God is sovereign and in control, and God is love. And we only need to carry a human-sized load. Oftentimes what happens with anxiety is we're trying to carry more than God has asked us to carry, and we end up trying to do everything on our own steam. And so just lighting a candle by faith to remember that God is light and in him is no darkness at all. I'm really particularly excited and grateful for this episode because when I speak and travel and do my consulting and my workshops, almost every time somebody will come up to me quietly and they want to know how to handle a mismatched relationship. By mismatched relationship, I mean there are two people in the relationship and only one of them seems to be trying to keep the relationship healthy. The other one is either toxic or they don't care, or sometimes they don't know how to do it. And what ends up happening is the person coming to me is typically trying everything they know to try, and they're adjusting their behavior and they're trying different things, but no matter what they do, they cannot seem to make the other person want to be well, and it's really heartbreaking. Now, this is heartbreaking in any dynamic. Sometimes it's a boss, for example, that you're working with and you're like, he or she just doesn't care. But when it gets particularly heartbreaking is when it's a family relationship. For example, a marriage, where maybe one spouse really longs to have a healthy, intimate, emotionally safe, life-giving relationship, and the other spouse either doesn't know how to do that, or oftentimes what happens is they don't care, or in some occasions, they are actively sabotaging the relationship. And so, like in any relationship, it's not that one person is always perfect and the other one is always doing terrible things, but there are certainly times where one person is primarily the bad actor and the other person is doing everything they can to make it work. This is a really common human dynamic. And we get into this on Being Human. We talk about attempted solutions and predictable patterns. And my guest today, Lysa TerKeurst, is a phenomenal guide for this very dynamic. Many of you probably know Lysa. She's quite well known. She's an incredibly gifted Bible teacher and preacher. I have personally benefited from her teaching and preaching. Even on this interview, I was learning so much, what you're about to witness. I was learning so much in real time from Lysa. I was so grateful. But after a few decades of marriage, she found herself in this dynamic where she was married to somebody who had a secret life, had all kinds of things going on, and she was trying to figure out what was going on, and Lysa was doing everything she could do to keep the marriage afloat, and it ended in divorce. And she wrote this amazing book. Lysa has written a number of books, but this book, Surviving an Unwanted Divorce. We get right into it in the show on what it's like to notice when your spouse is behaving badly and you're doing everything you can do. We talk about codependency, we talk about attempted solutions, and we talk about the pain and agony of having to make the most difficult decision. This book that Lysa wrote is phenomenal, and as she said in the foreword, it's a book she never wished she would have to write, but also it's a book that she wished that she had when she went through her divorce. So, this may not directly relate to you, but I bet you have somebody in your life who is in a mismatched relationship, who is crying out for some kind of a resource and some kind of guidance. On this conversation, Lysa gives us several tangible things that you can do or your loved one can do to be well in this situation. Let's join now. Lysa, one of the common challenges in a divorce, especially when you've been married as long as you had been, is you kind of come to a slow sinking suspicion. It takes a while, and then suddenly you get clear on something. And as I was reading your book, that seemed to be your story. I'd love to hear from you about what that's like to have a suspicion and then suddenly you see something and it's almost like, man, why didn't I get this clarity earlier? But that's not the way it works. Tell us about
Right,
that.
right. Well, I think that there were a couple of dynamics at play for me. One is I saw things that didn't add up, that didn't quite make sense, that made me tilt my head. The thing was, though, as a Christian wife, I had sort of trained myself to always believe the best, speak life over my husband. And those are great qualities to believe the best about someone and to speak life over them until you are in a dynamic of not just a difficult marriage, but a destructive marriage. And I didn't realize that my husband was living a secret double life. I didn't know that. Um, so I think the dynamics of me sort of overriding what I saw for the sake of peace and for the sake of believing the best about my husband, I think that was at play. I also think that gaslighting can have a very profound effect on someone's psyche. And when I would see something and I would question it, and then I was told that, that wasn't what I saw, that wasn't what I heard, that wasn't what I experienced, then when that happens and you're in a close-knit relationship where for decades this person has been your person, then the damage that can happen is I started to believe that I was the crazy one. And so then I became afraid to tell other people what I was experiencing because I thought they're going to believe him. After all, I can't quite find the definitive proof that I need. And to be honest with you, I didn't want that to be my reality. So I'm not sure I even was acknowledging the full reality of what I was experiencing. And so there was a lot of dynamics at play. And I think it all came to a head when it was the day before my oldest daughter's rehearsal dinner at my house. And I found something that then reality slammed into me, and I could no longer deny what this was.
And that
And
was the burner
finally,
phone.
yeah, it was. And it was shocking. The timing of it was shocking because my house was filling up with people. This is supposed to be my daughter's happiest weekend of her life. And now I've just discovered something that means I'm about to walk toward a future that is so very uncertain, so very terrifying. And yet, where I'm standing right now today is I need to put a big smile on my face and I need to be very present with my daughter. And it was, I would say, definitely psychologically, emotionally, it was one of the most traumatic realities of my life ever to try to manage what I just discovered and what I needed to do for my daughter.
Lysa, once you got through the rehearsal and all that comes with that, you're then left with yourself and the evidence and this profound shock and this fissure in your relationship. Oftentimes, this also comes with clarity, relief. It's like a mix of clashing feelings. Was that your experience as well?
I don't think I'd hit the clarity and relief yet because when I confronted my then husband, um, I was only given as much information as what I discovered, but there was never an additional disclosure, which then would have given me confidence that I actually knew the truth. And so the only things that he would admit to at that point is just what I could discover. And so when that happens, that creates this very strange dynamic of feeling like I want to believe the words you're saying, that you still want your family, but then your actions are pointing in a different direction. And so there wasn't enough clarity for me to have any sort of relief, like I finally know what's going on, because there was this very long stretch of time where I did not know what was going on. And I couldn't I couldn't even get to ground zero because it's like almost when I would catch my breath, I would make another discovery. And it was almost even more terrifying than the last discovery. And then there would be another confrontation. And then there would be this, further gaslighting, further. It was it wasn't a one and done shock and awe, like boom, we're at ground zero. It just wasn't that. It leaked in these traumatic moments that just started adding up um, to just complete devastation.
I think most of us have had some kind of a relationship with a very toxic person, maybe even someone with narcissistic personality disorder. And the general rule is you always need help. I don't care how much experience you have, how much training you have. You shouldn't try to relate, for example, to a narcissist by yourself. But when you're in a marriage and there is that Christian tendency to honor the spouse, and the temptation to keep it a secret is so high. You write about in your book secret keeping, and not that you're spilling to everybody, but the need to get it out and get help. That first time you did that, what was that like?
Oh, it was completely terrifying. And, you know, the the person that I called in that moment, she not only had been a very long-standing friend, someone that I really trusted. She knew the Bible, but she also had her master's in counseling. And she did the very best thing for me. And she just said, Lisa, I believe you. And, those words don't seem so profound as we sit here today, but in that moment, it was the most profound and important thing she could say because she didn't put me in a position where I had to explain it, where I had to justify why I thought this, where I had to present a bunch of proof to her. I told her my experience and she believed me. And I would encourage anyone. Look, I had been experiencing other things in my marriage, and I kept silent about it for a very, very, very long time. I was scared to bring it to the light because I didn't know what to do with it and I didn't know who to trust with it. I had the added dynamic also of being a visible person in a visible ministry. And so that even made me more leery to tell other people. Um, so I think it's really important for us to understand, though, there's a big difference between keeping secrets and holding things private. Keeping secrets is for the purpose of hiding, so bad behavior most likely will continue. Holding things private is for the sake of healing. So you'll notice even when I share my story, I don't share a ton of details about my story. I hold a lot of that private for the sake of not only my continued healing, but also my kids and my grandkids. But it is crucial that we don't try to go at this alone. And, you mentioned narcissistic personality disorder. Very few people are actually diagnosed NPD.
Yeah.
Most of the time, we're on some sort of scale. And it can be, garden variety selfishness down here, all the way to narcissistic behaviors, narcissistic tendencies, narcissistic, patterns, and then narcissistic personality disorder, and then a sociopath. So there's this big continuum and I would just say, when you confront a spouse that is supposed to love you and is supposed to seek your highest good, and you're legitimately concerned, and they have anything other than a very humble response, and the attitude needs to be help me understand. I want to answer your questions. Here's my phone, here's my computer. I want to do everything I can to ease the confusion that you're feeling. If the response is anything other than that, then it's deeply concerning. It's just deeply concerning. And that doesn't mean that there's a full on fire, but where there's smoke, there is some sort of a fire. And so that's why it's crucial. Do not go at this alone. Don't try to navigate the psychological nuances and the psychological games and the emotional abuse and the destructive patterns. Don't try to navigate that on your own. Find some trusted people that can help you.
Lisa, you were married almost 30 years. As you look back on those decades, uh, just roughly how much of that do you think was this kind of deceit where you were kept in the dark and things were happening?
I will never know the answer to that question. I'll never know. You know, I used to sit around and try to figure that out. And my therapist gave me some really wise advice. He said, Lisa, when you try to make sense of something that makes no sense, you'll lose all sense. And so, I don't know that it's as important for me to try to figure that out now at this point as it is for me just to accept what I do know and move forward, holding myself together, even though, what was such a massive part of my life fell apart. And, there's a really interesting scripture that I always like to bring up to people who are seeking closure. It's so understandable to want those answers. It's so understandable to want to know what's the full scope of this? What's every detail of this? How did I miss this? When did it start? When did it stop? How could this be? Like where was I? All of those questions are so understandable. And I just want to speak very tenderly to anyone who has those. Like, I get it. Our brain is wired for the confidence of knowing. That's
Yeah.
how we scan our environment and we determine, are we safe? Are we not safe? So look, I get it. But a passage I love to turn to is in Mark chapter 14. And I believe that this whole section of scripture starts at verse 32. And by the time we get down to, I believe it's verse 36, Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane about to go to the cross. The soldiers are on their way to arrest him. Jesus cries out two distinct prayers to the Father. The first is, he says, I am overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Now, this is Jesus crying this out, right? The second thing he prays is, God, anything is possible for you. Let this cup pass from me. So, in these two prayers, here's what really rattles me in the best of ways. Jesus was full divinity and full humanity at the same time. He was sinless, but he was very much sinned against. That means in his fullness of divinity, he had the answer to every question. He knew why, when, how, where, all what. He knew all of the answers to all the questions. And having the answers to those questions did not ease the ache of his sorrow because he still cried out, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. So it's not the answers to all of those questions that will give us the closure and the comfort to get over our suffering. It's not those answers because we're probably never going to get them. What it is acceptance. And we see Jesus doing that in the very last thing he prays. Yet, not what I will, but what you will, God. In other words, I am accepting what is reality in this moment. I don't want it. It's grieving my soul, but I'm willing to walk toward it because it's real. It's reality. Another thing that my counselor, who is one of my co-authors for this book, Surviving an Unwanted Divorce, another thing he said to me is, Lisa, mental health is a commitment to reality at all costs. And so it's crucial that I stay committed to what is real and accept even a future that I didn't see, I didn't want. And it's really hard to walk toward a future that you didn't see coming and that you didn't want. But it is important to accept what is, and what we can change, change it. But what we can't change, we have to accept it.
What I really love about what you just led us through is I feel like, Lisa, you gave us such a tactical and tangible way to live by faith.
Mm,
You're actually casting a vision for reality and truth, but you're doing it in the context of not needing to know what your heart desperately wants to know. I really appreciate that. That really is an exercise of faith and trust that any one of us can participate in today.
mhm. Yeah. And I think sometimes when we go through trauma of any kind, it's so tempting to go shopping for pain. It's not that we're actually shopping for pain, but it's like we're trying to figure this out. Why did this happen? What could have been done differently? Just like we were saying, all those questions, right? But what usually happens is the even the discoveries that we do make, even the answers we do get to some of those questions, it's not what will really comfort us. And so now I call it shopping for pain. I don't want to go on Instagram and find out what was he doing 5 years ago? What is he doing today? Who is he with? How is he? Is he happy? Is he sad? Like that's just not going to be helpful for me. And so I think we have to be really cautious, especially with social media, because so much, we can discover so much so quickly. And so I think it's a personal exercise of self control just to say, it is what it is, but I'm not going to go try to get more details at this point because it's just going to hurt me.
Yeah. It's such a common dynamic in these situations that one person is doing something that's making you anxious. And then you make a little micro adjustment of some kind to try to keep everything stable. And the micro adjustment may be, I'm not going to look into it. It might be that. It might be changing your behavior to try to change another person. One of the things that we really help our audience with on this show is paying attention to the patterns that infect all our relationships.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering what you think about that. Like, this pattern would be known as the attempted solution. Like, okay, he's behaving badly, so I'm going to be the best wife I can be. I don't know that that was your situation, but some kind of a response to try to keep everything in equilibrium. I think this is such a common thing. I'd love to hear any experiences you had with that, what that was like for you.
Oh, absolutely. I did exactly what you were describing. You know, I just thought, okay, he's making these choices. So therefore, I need to elevate everything about my role as a wife. I need to be the best wife. I need to be the most forgiving. I need to be, willing to save my family at all costs. And it almost cost me everything. I made the big discovery in February of 2016. And by June of 2016, my colon had twisted around itself, cut off the blood flow inside of me. I had to have emergency surgery, and the doctors weren't sure that they could save my life. So I almost died because of this. And the doctor was so concerned about what he saw physically that he took a picture of that surgery so that when I woke up that I could see whatever it was that was traumatizing me. And at that point I wasn't telling the doctor. But he said something is causing you serious trauma and I want you to see with your own eyes physically what it's doing to you. And I remember I took that picture to my counselor, and my counselor said, I've never seen a picture of the physical ramifications of emotional trauma. And he said, but this is astounding. And he said, Lysa, it's not that I want you to frame this picture and put it up in your house, not at all. He said, but I want you to keep this tucked in the back of your mind. Let this be a screenshot that you take in the back of your mind and always factor that in. Factor it in for how long can you really put up with the behavior that you are experiencing, not just the mistakes, but the patterns of behavior that are becoming destructive, not just to your marriage, but to you personally.
And then, even then, this is such a common thing. Like, if I remember right, you still a couple of years later had a vow renewal, a
Yes.
second chance, let's try again, like anything possible to save this thing. And
Hmm.
then at some point, you just wake up and realize there's nothing left to save.
Hmm.
I have a friend whose wife was a serial adulterer. He was raised in a Christian tradition that divorce is never an option. And he was sitting with his friends one day. This is an old story a long time ago. And he kept saying, I just need to work harder. I need to save the marriage. And his friends just checked. And she had left. She was now with another guy. And she was building a life with this other guy. And his friend said to him, there's nothing left to save. Like, you we want to set you free because you're fighting for something that doesn't exist. It was very healing for my friend.
Mm,
You also made all of these efforts. And then at some point you realize there's nothing more I can, like, the power to change is in the other's hand.
that's
That's
right.
a difficult realization to come to.
It is. So, in the state of North Carolina, which is where we lived at the time, you have to be separated, physically separated for a year and a day before you can even file for divorce. So, I decided to take that final year and remove my hands of influence, just remove my influence off of him totally, and to completely separate. And I thought this will go in one of two directions. Either he will press in or he will check out. And so, but regardless, I was no longer going to be in the business of saving him. He has a savior, but it's not me. And at the end of that year, I got clarity. It was not the clarity that I wanted, but it was the clarity that I needed. And in the end, I didn't walk away from my marriage. I accepted the very painful reality that was before me. And I made the most God honoring choice at that point. And, the relationship had gotten to a place where it was not sustainable at all. And it was also, he'd made his choice and it wasn't me. So I had to accept that. And, but, I think there were healthy reasons that I stayed for so long and fought so hard. And I think there were very unhealthy reasons.
Yeah.
I think I definitely was a codependent enabler. Um, I didn't understand a lot of those psychological terms when I was going through this. I didn't know. I thought, Jesus models, lay down your life for another person. That's noble, that's honorable, that's holy. And then one day I was reading that scripture and I recognized something absolutely crucial. Jesus did model and teach us to lay down our life. Jesus laid down his life, but Jesus did not lay down his life to enable bad behavior to continue. Jesus laid down his life for a high and holy purpose. And so, I think there were healthy reasons. I think there were unhealthy reasons that I fought so hard. But in the end, I fought so hard and stayed so long. And one benefit of that, there's some negatives to it, but one benefit of that is I reduced my post divorce regret down to zero. My kids saw how hard I tried. Everybody around me saw how hard I tried. And everybody around me in the end um, just said, similar to what your story was, there's nothing here to save.
Yeah. Thank you so much for saying that there were healthy and unhealthy reasons. I think when we start to see these patterns, like they do sneak up on us, and then suddenly we realize, what am I doing? We can feel so foolish, but really, we were doing the best we knew to do. We were
Yes.
earnestly giving it, like, there's really something admirable about that. And then often what happens is by the time somebody gets that clarity, it's almost like they have no emotional reserves left to do the difficult thing. Like this pattern has worn them down. They've been in more of the same and try harder for so long that they finally realize, I can't do this, but now they're just depleted. Oftentimes, what we coach people to do is, okay, your next step is to work on being well, because now
Mm.
you have to have the emotional reserves to do this, one of the most hardest things in your life. What are just a couple of habits that you began to practice that helped you be well?
Well, a couple of things that were really important to me for me is once I was no longer working on him, for so long, I had been working harder on him than he was willing to work on him. And so once I stopped that, removed my influence off of him, it was time to work on me. And I had to recognize that my my issues were not justifications for his behavior, but my issues were still something I needed to tend to. I needed to
Mm.
work on my codependency. And when I say codependency, the best way I can describe that for people is this: I need you to be okay so I can be okay. So, how can I make you okay? Because I want to feel okay, okay? You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
And so I had to work on that. And there were several practices, but probably the most important was learning how to draw appropriate and healthy boundaries. And I recognized I was not very good at that. And so I had to recognize too that you don't put boundaries on another person to try to force them to change. You put boundaries on yourself by reducing the access that you grant this person down to their demonstrated level of responsibility.
Mm.
And so, and God modeled this. God, boundaries are not just a good idea, they're actually God's idea. And when God established the temple, I think this is very fascinating. When God established the temple, he allowed certain people certain access, but not all people all access. And it didn't mean that this group of people was more valuable than this group of people. It just means they had different responsibilities. And so the person granted the greatest access was the high priest, where he could actually once a year go into the Holy of Holies to make atonement for the people. So he was given great access. He had to demonstrate great responsibility. And if he didn't demonstrate responsibility to have that access, he would suffer the greatest consequence. So these two words, access and responsibility, became very important to me. And what I recognized and what I had to work on was I was giving level 10 access to someone who was only demonstrating a level 2 or 3 responsibility. And the distance between those, that's where you'll find chaos. And where you find chaos, that's where you'll find dysfunction. And where there's dysfunction, there's a needed boundary. So you can try to force this person to be more responsible, but chances are that external pressure is not going to create lasting change on someone who is incapable or unwilling of being more responsible with the access that you've granted them. So your responsibility is to put a boundary on yourself and reduce the access you give to that person down to their demonstrated level of responsibility. That's what I had to work on.
My goodness, that is such a stunning, practical, helpful way for us to really measure toxic relationships. I'm really grateful you just laid out the temple like that. I've never in my life thought about the temple boundary system through that lens, but it rings so true. I do want to pause my questions, Lysa, because you've just written and released this phenomenal book, quite possibly your most important book you've ever written. That's a bold thing to say to an author, but Surviving an Unwanted Divorce, you lay out clearly in this book, this is the book you never thought you would have to write, you never wanted to write, but you also say, this is the book I wish I had when I was going through my divorce. Like, and it is a combination. What I love about this book is the way you have written it with a theologian and a therapist. You know, your ministry is a hallmark of theology, psychology, practical tools. I think it's why you're such a powerful teacher. You also have a podcast with these guys. Let's just tell us briefly about the book, because it's been out like I think 3 days as of the release of this episode. It's brand new. Tell us a bit about the book, and then let's chat your podcast, and then I've got another question.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that it's an important work. I believe it is. It's a hard book because I never wanted this to be my life story. I certainly do not want to be the Christian poster child for divorce. I never, ever wanted the word divorce attached to my name, to my ministry, any of that. But as I accepted reality, I recognized I had unique access to these two men who were so profound with my healing journey. Dr. Joel Munimali, theologian, and Jim Kress, licensed professional counselor. And I kept thinking, I wish everyone had access to them because they're very educated, specialist in helping people navigate biblically and emotionally very, very traumatizing situations. Jim has, he specializes in betrayal trauma, and Joel has, along with me, he and I did it together. We did the entire biblical theology of divorce, what the Bible actually does and does not say. I mean, we're talking hundreds of hours. So this wasn't something we approached lightly because I never want to go to the text and try to use the text to justify what I want. I want the Bible to educate me and shape what I need to do. And so it was a very scary book to write. It was a very scary process to go through. But I knew I had this special access. I had this special insight. I had this wisdom that could help other people. And I'm in a different season now. I am, on to new things. I'm remarried and, life is beautiful and amazing, not perfect, but amazing. And the last thing I really want to do is go back to the most painful years of my life and write this book and potentially give people the impression like, oh, Lisa's so pro divorce. I'm not pro divorce. I'm pro healthy marriages. But I just felt like if I don't do it, who will? Who will? The unique thing that the three of us bring to the table is not just the theology and not just the therapy, but also the experiential wisdom where I can sit across the table from a person who's just been completely devastated in their marriage. And now they're suffering the death of their marriage. And I can say, I get it. I really get it. And I'm going to speak to you tenderly, but I'm also going to take your hand and I'm going to help you learn how to hold yourself together when it feels like your world is falling apart.
Yeah, the book is Surviving an Unwanted Divorce. Lysa is a gifted author. It's worth reading just for the power of her writing. But this particular book, whether you are in the midst of it or wondering about it or recovering from it, or you have a wonderful set of relationships, it is worth a read. It is worth understanding the dynamics where maybe your relationships are well, but you know somebody that is really struggling. These kinds of situations are so profoundly isolating that
Hmm.
I think one of the gifts that you've given us, Lysa, is you help people feel seen.
Yeah.
And then not just in the book, but we'll also put in the link to the show notes. I'm a sucker for a good podcast, and my goodness, therapy and theology, what a treat that show is. So Lysa also hosts a first class podcast. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. Um, Lysa, we're in an era of being human where we're helping our audience notice when they're no longer human sized. And the simple idea is that when we're human sized, we're able to notice God's presence. We can relax into God's presence. We have a better chance of seeing what's true and what's real. But then when we're not human sized, we tend to cope by trying to get bigger. Sometimes we get aggressive, domineering, we interrupt people. Sometimes it's as simple as we give advice when the situation does not call for advice. I know I'm prone to that. Sometimes we get smaller than human. We diminish ourselves. We muzzle our voice. Just through when things were really rough, what was your experience of seeing either you or your husband or others getting bigger or smaller than human?
Yeah. So I won't talk about his experience. That's his story to tell. But my experience, I desire peace. I, more than control, more than anything else. I just want peace. That's what I really, really crave. And so I had gotten into a very bad habit of making myself small just so I could have some semblance of peace when someone else is making themselves big in order to reach, some sort of an equilibrium. It's like, okay, well, if this is big, then I need to be small so we can hopefully right the scales a little bit. And what that means for me is I minimized my thoughts. I minimized my opinions. I minimized my accomplishments. I minimized what I was actually experiencing. And then what I would do often is I would have a conversation with someone. I would minimize the bad I was experiencing in that relationship and maximize any little tiny crumb of good that there was. And I think I did that because trauma is not just what happens to us, but trauma is also the story we tell ourselves because of what's happening to us. And I wanted the story to be that this is going to be a story of redemption. This is going to get better. Like I mean, one day God's going to use us to help save other marriages. I just know it. And, that's what I wanted the story to be. And I became so attached to that outcome. I was willing to play that game of minimizing all of the bad and maximizing the crumbs of good. And in the end, it didn't do me any favors. It just really didn't. It made me a shell of a person. And it's taken me years to untangle a lot of that.
Yeah. Lysa, thank you so much for what you've been willing to share on this show. I'm just, as I've been listening to you, I'm just so grateful. You've given us some very practical ways to measure the health of our relationships, measure the health of our coping mechanisms. And also, of course, in your book, which we will link in the notes, and your podcast, your whole ministry really is designed to help people be free in Christ.
Mhm.
And just I'm grateful for that. We are regrettably going to have to now pivot to probably the part of the show that you've been most, what's the word, Lysa, dreading. I mean, when I think about you, you have navigated the gauntlet of the online dating world. You are now remarried. That means that you actually successfully navigated a dating app, which is its own gold medal. You have preached to thousands of people. You have successfully, I say this as a Western Australian raised in a beach culture, Lysa, you've successfully navigated a boogie board um, as an adult, which is no small thing. And yet, you have not yet endured the gauntlet that is on the Being Human podcast. So, without further ado, just a handful of questions. Here's the first one. What is one thing that you think you need in any given moment that you don't actually need?
My cell phone.
Okay. Tell us more about that.
Well, I think our cell phones, just last Friday, I accidentally left my cell phone at the hotel. And I was an hour away at the airport and just panicked because everything is on my cell phone. And I thought, I don't have my boarding pass. I don't have, a way to contact anyone. I don't know what to do. And the reality is, I could walk up to the desk and I could get a printed boarding pass. The reality is, I do have a couple of phone numbers that I could call somebody. The reality is that my life was not going to end if I didn't have this little device. And so I did get my cell phone back, and it made me feel a lot better when I had it back. But, I think it clued me into what are things in my life that I'm relying on and saying, I have to have this, when in reality, I don't actually have to have it. So the cell phone is definitely one of them. Another one would be, I don't actually have to have a sweet treat after I eat a savory meal. I think I do. I think it's absolutely essential. What is a meal without dessert, right? I don't have to have that. So, yeah.
Very good. Okay. Second question. Is there a recurring statement your inner critic says to you? And if so, do you do anything to quiet its voice?
I've gotten a lot better at this, but yes, there's definitely a couple of things my inner critic will say to me. My inner critic will say, like, "Oh, Lysa, why are you so forgetful? Why are you like, especially like when I left my cell phone? I
Mm,
mean, full blown, like, what is wrong with you? Why did you leave your cell phone? All you need a checklist, and you know this. So when you leave the hotel room, you should have this little checklist. And because you didn't do the checklist, you're just so irresponsible. You're so forgetful. It's those kinds of things. I was doing a podcast one time with Craig Rochelle,
yeah.
and I was telling him about this issue of misplacing my cell phone. And he gave me the best advice. So if I will just implement his advice, I do so much better. He said, Lysa, when you set your cell phone down, say, I am putting my cell phone on the table. He said, say it out loud. Or I am putting my cell phone on the kitchen counter, or I am putting my cell phone on my bathroom counter. I am putting my cell phone on my nightstand. He said, if you'll just verbalize it, you have a much higher likelihood of remembering where you actually put it. And I thought, that is such good advice. Thank you, Craig Rochelle. Now I just need to remember to implement it.
It's fantastic. I love that. Okay. Tell me about a behavior in another person that is guaranteed to trigger you.
A behavior in another person that is absolutely guaranteed to trigger me is when I sense someone stretching the truth. And I'm so sensitive to that. And I'm like, look, I can handle whatever truth you tell me, good or bad, but at least tell me the truth so that I can deal in reality. What I can't sometimes feel like I can handle is when someone presents something one way and I already know that's actually not true. And I have a really keen, discerning spirit. And so, even if there's just a part of the story that someone's exaggerating, it makes me feel like I can't trust that person because I don't know where reality ended and the exaggeration began. I just know there's something not quite right there.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. Final question. When in your life lately have you felt most fully and completely loved?
Um, I feel so completely loved when I spend time with my grandkids. They think that I am just an absolutely fun, incredible person, and they want more than anything to spend time with me, and they tell me I'm beautiful and I'm funny. They laugh at my jokes. They're willing to play cards with me. And so yeah, I feel so alive, and I just feel so fulfilled when I'm with my grandkids. Right behind that is being with a man who treasures me. My husband now, he treasures me. And I catch him sometimes talking to other people about me. Like I'll hear him on the phone with his friends, or overhear him like at church. He'll have a side conversation with someone, and I can just kind of hear him. And to hear him describe me and talk about me in such lovely, lovely ways is just a balm to my heart, and so redemptive and so sweet. And I just feel so alive and well with a man that I can trust.
Mm. Well, my guest has been Lysa TerKeurst. Her most recent book, out now, Surviving an Unwanted Divorce. Lisa, on behalf of my audience, who are very precious to me, we have a great community here on Being Human. I just want to thank you for the hard work that you have done. This conversation, your book, your podcast is obviously the result of stewarding a lot of pain and sharing it with others in a way that they can find healing. Thank you for coming on Being Human.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's a real honor to be with you.